My husband announced at Thanksgiving dinner, "I'm selling the house. My girlfriend needs somewhere bigger for her kids." Our adult children sat stunned as he detailed his new life. I quietly stood, walked to my purse and handed him an envelope. "Since you're making announcements." Inside the envelope were. The cranberry sauce was still bubbling on the stove when Taylor's phone buzzed for the 7th time that morning. I watched him glance at it through the kitchen doorway, his face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. "Not for me anyway. Honey, could you help me move the turkey?" I called out, wrestling with the 20-pound bird that had been roasting since dawn. The kitchen smelled like sage and butter, exactly the way my mother's had when I was Faith's age. I'd been up since 5, determined to make this Thanksgiving perfect. "In a minute," he muttered, thumbs flying across his screen. I hefted the turkey myself, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back that reminded me I wasn't 25 anymore. 47 years old, and my husband couldn't tear himself away from his phone long enough to help me with the meal I'd spent a week planning. But I swallowed the irritation. Today was about family. Hunter had driven in from Chicago the night before, looking handsome in his new suit jacket but tired around the eyes. His consulting job was demanding, but he'd made the effort to be here. Faith had arrived that morning with her usual whirlwind energy, arms full of wine bottles and stories about her graduate program. Seeing them both at our dining room table again, laughing and catching up, made every hour of preparation worth it. The dining room looked picture-perfect. I'd used my grandmother's china, the delicate blue pattern that only came out for special occasions. The centerpiece was a cornucopia I'd spent 2 hours arranging with miniature pumpkins, autumn leaves and battery-operated candles that flickered like real flames. Taylor had walked past it 3 times without a single comment. "Mom, this stuffing is incredible," Hunter said, helping himself to a second serving. "Is this the same recipe Grandma used?" "With a few modifications," I smiled, watching him savor each bite. "I added some dried cherries this year." Faith raised her wine glass. "To Mom for pulling off another Thanksgiving miracle." Her cheeks were flushed from the Pinot Noir, and she looked so young and happy that my heart squeezed. We clinked glasses and for a moment, everything felt right. This was what I'd imagined when I was folding napkins at 6 in the morning, when I was hand-mashing potatoes instead of using the mixer because they tasted better that way. This warmth, this connection, this sense of belonging. Taylor's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it and something shifted in his expression. "Everything okay, Dad?" Faith asked, noticing his distraction. "Fine," he said quickly, sliding the phone into his pocket. But his leg was bouncing under the table the way it did when he was anxious about something. I'd been married to this man for 23 years. I knew his tells. The way he cleared his throat when he was about to say something difficult. The way he avoided eye contact when he was hiding something. The way he straightened his shoulders when he was about to make a pronouncement he thought was important. He was doing all 3 right now. "Actually," Taylor said, standing up so abruptly that his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. The sound cut through our conversation like a knife. Hunter and Faith looked up at him, forks halfway to their mouths. He cleared his throat. There was. "I have something to tell everyone." His voice had that forced casualness he used in business meetings, the tone that said he'd rehearsed this moment. My stomach dropped. "Taylor," I said quietly, "can't this wait until after dinner?" He didn't look at me. "I'm selling the house." The words hit the table like a physical blow. Faith's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Hunter's fork clattered against his plate. "What?" Faith whispered. But Taylor wasn't finished. He was looking past us now as if he were addressing a boardroom instead of his family. "Holly and the kids need more space. Jack is 8 now, Joel's 6 and little Elise just turned 4. They're growing fast and her apartment is too small." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Holly. He'd said her name in our dining room at our Thanksgiving table in front of our children. The woman whose existence I'd been pretending not to know about for months. Hunter's face had gone pale. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "Holly's my girlfriend," Taylor continued as if he were discussing the weather. "We've been together for 8 months now. She has 3 kids from her previous marriage and they need stability. A real home." Faith made a sound like she'd been punched. "Girlfriend." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching my children's faces crumble. This was how he chose to tell them. Not privately, not gently, not with any consideration for their feelings. Like a business transaction. The house will sell quickly in this market, Taylor went on, oblivious to the devastation he was causing. Holly found a beautiful place in Westfield with a big backyard and good schools. 5 bedrooms, 3 baths. The kids will love it. What about us? Faith's voice was barely a whisper. What about Mom? Finally, Taylor looked at me. There was something almost defiant in his expression, as if he expected me to make a scene. To cry or scream or beg. To give him a reason to paint me as the hysterical wife who couldn't handle his happiness. Instead, I stood up slowly, calmly, and walked to my purse on the kitchen counter. My hands were steady as I retrieved the envelope I'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Or maybe waiting for the worst moment, which apparently was now. I walked back to the table and placed the envelope next to his plate, right on top of the gravy stain he'd made during his little speech. Since you're making announcements, I said quietly, meeting his eyes for the first time all day. Then I sat back down, picked up my fork and took a bite of sweet potato casserole. It tasted like ash, but I chewed it anyway, maintaining eye contact with the man who had just destroyed our family's Thanksgiving with the casual cruelty of someone reading a grocery list. The envelope sat there between us like a loaded weapon, and for the first time since he'd started talking, Taylor looked uncertain. Taylor's fingers hovered over the cream-colored envelope like it might bite him. The confident businessman who had just announced the sale of our family home was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely afraid. His hand shook as he picked it up, feeling its weight. What is it, Dad? Hunter's voice cut through the tension, but his eyes never left his father's face. There was something different in my son's expression, a hardness I'd never seen before. The man he'd looked up to his entire life had just revealed himself to be a stranger. Taylor turned the envelope over, examining the seal. I'd written his name in my careful cursive, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards and anniversary notes for over 2 decades. But this felt different. Final. Jordan, what? He started, but the words died in his throat when he looked at me. I kept my expression neutral, almost serene. Let him wonder. Let him sweat. Faith was studying both of us, her wine glass forgotten in her hand. Mom, are you okay? Her voice was small, vulnerable. She was still processing her father's bombshell, trying to understand how her world had just shifted on its axis. I reached across the table and squeezed her free hand. I'm fine, sweetheart. And surprisingly, I was. For the first time in months, I felt completely in control. Taylor slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket without opening it. The relief on his face was almost comical, as if postponing the inevitable would somehow make it disappear. But I could see the curiosity eating at him, the way his hand kept drifting back to his pocket. Aren't you going to open it? Hunter asked, his tone carrying an edge that made Taylor flinch. Later, Taylor mumbled, reaching for his water glass. His throat had gone dry. The atmosphere around our beautiful Thanksgiving table had shifted completely. What had been warm family conversation was now stilted and uncomfortable. Faith kept glancing between her father and me, trying to piece together a puzzle she didn't have all the parts to. Hunter had stopped eating entirely, his jaw clenched tight. I continued with my meal, savoring each bite. The turkey was perfectly moist, the stuffing had just the right amount of herbs, and the cranberry sauce had that perfect balance of tart and sweet. All those hours of preparation hadn't been wasted after all. This meal would definitely be memorable. So, I said conversationally, cutting another piece of turkey, how long has Holly been helping you make decisions about our home? Taylor's fork clattered against his plate. Jordan, not now. When then? I asked, my voice still calm. After you've packed my belongings? After you've changed the locks? Faith's wine glass hit the table harder than she intended. You're really doing this? You're really leaving Mom for some woman with kids? It's complicated, Taylor said, the classic response of a man who knew he was wrong but couldn't admit it. No, Hunter said firmly, it's really not complicated at all. That's when Taylor's phone started buzzing. He glanced at the screen and I saw her name flash across it. Holly. Even now, even in the middle of destroying his family, she couldn't leave him alone for one meal. The phone buzzed again. And again. Answer it, I said quietly. Don't let us stop you from attending to your priorities. He declined the call, his face flushing red. It's work. Faith actually laughed, but there was no humor in it. On Thanksgiving? At 7 p.m.? The phone buzzed a fourth time. Taylor's composure was cracking. He kept touching his pocket where the envelope lay hidden, his leg bouncing more frantically under the table. You know what? Hunter stood up abruptly, his napkin falling to the floor. I've lost my appetite. He looked at his father with such disappointment that even I felt it. 23 years of marriage, Dad. 23 years of what I thought was a happy family. And you announce your affair at Thanksgiving dinner like you're discussing quarterly earnings. Hunter, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Hunter's voice was cold, controlled. You decided your happiness was worth more than Mom's dignity. Worth more than our family traditions. Worth more than looking your children in the eye without lying. Taylor opened his mouth to respond, but Hunter was already walking away. We heard his footsteps on the stairs, then the firm click of his childhood bedroom door closing. Faith's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Daddy, she whispered, using the name she hadn't called him in years, how could you do this to us? For a moment, Taylor's mask slipped completely. I saw regret flicker across his features, genuine pain at hurting his daughter. But then his phone buzzed again and the moment was gone. This time he answered it. I can't talk right now, he said in a low voice, turning away from the table. But Faith and I could hear Holly's voice through the speaker, sharp and demanding. We couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. She wasn't happy about being ignored. I said I can't talk, Taylor repeated, his voice strained. He ended the call and immediately turned his phone face down on the table. The silence that followed was deafening. Faith was staring at her father like she was seeing him for the first time. I continued eating, letting the quiet stretch between us. Sometimes silence said more than words ever could. Finally Faith spoke. I think I need some air. She stood up carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled. Mom, would you like help clearing the table? That's all right, sweetheart. Go get some fresh air. After she left, it was just Taylor and me, sitting across from each other at the table where we'd shared countless meals, celebrated birthdays, helped our children with homework, planned our future. The envelope in his pocket might as well have been a ticking bomb. Jordan, he said finally, we need to talk. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. When had he become so much of a stranger? When had the man I'd loved enough to build a life with turned into someone who could devastate his family over dessert and pie? No, I said simply, standing and beginning to stack the plates. We really don't. That night I went to bed early and locked the bedroom door behind me. I could hear Taylor pacing downstairs, probably trying to work up the courage to open the envelope. Let him pace. Let him wonder. I slept better than I had in months. The morning after Thanksgiving I woke to an empty house. Taylor had left before dawn, probably to avoid facing the envelope still burning a hole in his jacket pocket. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen, watching steam rise from my mug as memories I'd been suppressing for months finally surfaced. It had started in March. Such an ordinary Tuesday when everything began to unravel, though I didn't know it then. Taylor came home 3 hours late, his collar slightly wrinkled, claiming the client meeting had run over. I'd heated his dinner in the microwave, asked about his day, listened to his tired responses. The perfect trusting wife. But something felt off. Maybe it was the way he avoided my eyes, or how he showered immediately instead of collapsing on the couch like usual. Small things. Tiny fractures in our routine that I explained away because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. The late nights became a pattern. Big presentation tomorrow, he'd say, grabbing his laptop bag. Don't wait up. I'd lie in bed listening for his car in the driveway, checking the clock as midnight turned to 1 a.m. then 2. When I asked about the long hours, he'd sigh heavily, making me feel guilty for questioning his dedication to providing for our family. April brought the canceled plans. Our anniversary dinner reservation at Chez Laurent, the restaurant where he'd proposed 24 years ago, got postponed because of an emergency client crisis. The theater tickets Faith had given us for my birthday went unused when Taylor suddenly had to fly to Denver. Each disappointment came with elaborate apologies and promises to make it up to me later. Later never came. Holly Morrison first appeared as a name in casual conversation. Holly from accounting thinks we should restructure the quarterly reports. Holly suggested a new software system for tracking clients. Just another colleague in Taylor's expanding firm, someone whose opinion he valued professionally. Then I started seeing her in his phone. The first photo was innocent enough. A group shot from the office Christmas party I'd skipped because of the flu. Holly was blonde, petite, standing just close enough to Taylor to catch my attention. She had the kind of bright, unlined face that spoke of someone at least 10 years younger than my 47. But it was the second photo that made my stomach drop. Taylor and Holly at what looked like a coffee shop, her 3 young children clustered around them. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting on his arm, while a little girl with pigtails sat on his lap like she belonged there. I found it by accident, scrolling through his phone to check the weather when mine was charging. The photo was dated 2 weeks earlier, on a Saturday when Taylor had claimed to be playing golf with his college buddy Marcus. "Who are these children?" I asked that night, showing him the screen. My voice was calm, curious, giving him every opportunity to explain. Taylor barely glanced at the phone before launching into his response. "Oh, that's Holly from work. She's going through a messy divorce, needed someone to talk to. Those are her kids. Cute, right? Poor things are really struggling with their parents splitting up." The explanation was smooth, practiced, delivered with just the right amount of concern for Holly's fictional plight. But I noticed how he took his phone back immediately, how his thumb moved to delete the photo without thinking. "You're helping her with her divorce?" I pressed gently. "Someone has to." His tone carried that edge of righteousness that meant the conversation was over. "She doesn't have many friends, Jordan. Sometimes people just need support during difficult times." I wanted to believe him. Desperately. So I pushed down the sick feeling in my stomach and chose trust over suspicion. After all, this was Taylor, my Taylor, who brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning and remembered to pick up my favorite wine on his way home from work. But the phone calls started getting harder to ignore. Holly's name lighting up his screen during dinner, during our morning coffee, even during Hunter's graduation ceremony. Taylor would glance at it, frown, and let it go to voicemail. "She's having a rough time," he'd explain. "Probably needs advice about the custody battle." The custody battle that, as I later discovered, didn't exist because Holly had been divorced for 3 years. One evening in July, Faith called while Taylor was upstairs supposedly working. We were chatting about her summer internship when she mentioned seeing her father at the park near her apartment. "He was with some woman and her kids," Faith said casually. "Playing on the swings looked like a real family outing. I almost went over to say hi, but they seemed, I don't know, intimate? Like I'd be interrupting something private." My hands went cold. "What did the woman look like?" "Blonde, pretty, younger than you. The kids were adorable. 2 little boys and a girl. Dad was pushing the girl on the swing and she was giggling like crazy. It was actually really sweet, but..." Faith's voice trailed off. "But what, honey?" It was weird seeing Dad with other people's children. He seemed so natural with them, like he'd done it 100 times before. And the way the woman was looking at him. Faith paused. "Mom, is everything okay between you and Dad?" I lied smoothly, protecting both my daughter and myself. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Dad probably just ran into his coworker and her kids. You know how he is with children." But after I hung up, I sat in the darkened living room for hours, pieces of a puzzle I'd been refusing to see finally clicking into place. The late nights, the canceled plans, the constant phone calls, the photos, and now this. My husband playing family with another woman's children while I sat at home wondering where our marriage had gone wrong. That's when I stopped fighting for his attention and started paying attention instead. I listened when he talked, noting the small inconsistencies in his stories. I watched his face when his phone rang, recognizing the different expressions he wore for different callers. I began to document the changes in our finances, the unexplained withdrawals, the credit card charges from restaurants I'd never been to, the mysterious cash purchases that never had explanations. The word downsizing first came up in September. Taylor mentioned it casually over breakfast like he was discussing the weather. "Housing market's pretty hot right now," he said, not looking up from his tablet. "Might be smart to think about downsizing while we could get top dollar for this place." I knew then. The way he avoided my eyes, the careful casualness of his tone, the timing of it all. He wasn't planning to downsize with me. He was planning to upsize with someone else. But Taylor had made one crucial mistake in all his careful deception. He'd assumed I would remain the passive, trusting wife who swallowed every lie and accepted every excuse. He thought I'd sit quietly while he dismantled our life piece by piece. He had no idea that I'd already made an appointment with Clayton Richards, the best divorce attorney in the state. Clayton Richards' office smelled like leather and expensive cologne, the kind of place where powerful people came to dismantle their lives with precision. I sat across from his mahogany desk, hands folded, watching him review the folder I'd brought. Bank statements, credit card bills, photographs printed from social media. Evidence of a life being lived parallel to mine. "Mrs. Davidson," Clayton said, his silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, "I have to ask, are you certain you want to proceed this way?" I nodded, my voice steady. "I need to protect myself and my children. My husband thinks I'm naive. I'd prefer to keep it that way until I'm ready." What I didn't tell Clayton was how I'd discovered Holly's social media presence. It had been Faith, ironically, who'd mentioned seeing posts from someone at her father's company. "Dad's coworker is always posting these cute family photos," she'd said during one of our weekly phone calls. "Makes me miss being little." The name Holly Morrison had stuck in my mind until curiosity finally won. One evening while Taylor worked late, or claimed to, I'd searched for her online. What I found made my coffee go cold in my hands. Holly wasn't just posting family photos. He was crafting a narrative. Pictures of her children at parks I recognized, restaurants Taylor had mentioned visiting for work lunches, even the ice cream parlor where he'd taken Hunter and Faith when they were small. But it was the captions that truly stung. "Sunday adventures with my favorite people," she'd written beneath a photo of her daughter on the same swing set where Taylor had pushed Faith 20 years ago. The little girl was laughing, her blonde pigtails flying, while a man's hands I'd recognize anywhere, steadied her from behind. Another post showed her boys building sandcastles at the beach. "Teaching them that new beginnings can be beautiful," was the caption, posted the same weekend Taylor had told me he was attending a mandatory work retreat. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably there, was Taylor's distinctive blue polo shirt. The most devastating post came in October. A cozy dinner scene at what looked like Holly's apartment, candles flickering on a small table, her children in matching pajamas surrounding a man whose face was carefully cropped out of frame. The caption read, "Grateful for the man who shows my babies what real love looks like. Some people come into your life and make you realize what you've been missing." 37 likes. 12 comments from friends and family celebrating her happiness, congratulating her on finding someone special. I'd sat staring at my laptop screen until my eyes burned, wondering how many of these people knew her someone special was married. But it was the financial evidence that truly revealed the scope of Taylor's deception. While our own credit cards maxed out and bills piled up unpaid, mysterious charges appeared on statements I'd never seen before. A joint account I'd discovered purely by accident when mail was delivered to our address for Mr. and Mrs. T. Davidson. Except the Mrs. wasn't me. I'd opened that envelope with shaking hands, finding statements for a credit card I'd never signed for, in both Taylor's name and Holly Morrison's. The charges painted a picture of domestic bliss. Grocery stores, toy stores, children's clothing retailers. $600 at a place called Little Dreamers Furniture. Probably bunk beds for her boys. $400 at Princess Palace Boutique. Undoubtedly for her daughter. Meanwhile, our mortgage payment had been late twice, and I'd had to use my own savings to cover the electric bill when Taylor claimed his direct deposit was delayed. The most painful discovery came when I found receipts in Taylor's jacket pocket. Not suspicious on their own, just everyday purchases from Target and CVS. But the items told a story that broke my heart. Children's Tylenol, character band-aids with princesses and superheroes, bedtime storybooks, even a receipt for a birthday cake with "Happy 4th Birthday, Elise," written in pink frosting. He was living a complete father's life with Holly's children while his own adult children wondered why he seemed so distant during family calls. I started documenting everything. Screenshots of social media posts, copies of financial statements, photographs of receipts. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because Clayton had warned me that men like Taylor, successful, charming, well-connected, often tried to rewrite history during divorce proceedings. "He'll claim the money was for legitimate business expenses," Clayton had explained during our second meeting. "He'll say the social media posts are misunderstood, that he was just being friendly to a colleague going through a hard time." Men in his position are very good at controlling narratives. I kept everything in a safety deposit box at a bank across town, somewhere Taylor would never think to look. Every Friday I'd make my weekly deposits, adding new evidence to the growing pile. It felt like preparing for war, which I suppose it was. The breaking point came on our anniversary. October 15th. A date that had once meant romantic dinners and thoughtful gifts, long walks and whispered promises about growing old together. I'd made reservations at Chez Laurent 6 weeks in advance, confirming twice to make sure everything was perfect. At 5 o'clock I was putting on the black dress Taylor had once said made me look stunning. At 5:30 I was checking my makeup one final time. At 6 I was standing by the front door in my heels and coat, car keys in hand. Taylor's call came at 6:15. "Jordan, I'm so sorry but Holly's having an emergency." Complete breakdown about the custody situation. "I can't leave her alone with the kids in this state. Can we postpone? Maybe this weekend?" I'd stood in our entryway looking at myself in the mirror, dressed up with nowhere to go, married to a man who was somewhere else playing hero to another woman's crisis. The woman whose existence he'd once denied, whose relationship with him he'd minimized, whose children were now more important than his wife of 23 years. "Of course," I'd said, my voice calm as glass. "Family emergencies come first." After I hung up, I didn't change out of my dress. Instead, I drove to Chez Laurent alone, sat at our table for two, and enjoyed the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu. The wait staff was kind, pretending not to notice that the woman celebrating her anniversary was dining solo. That night, while Taylor was presumably comforting Holly through her convenient breakdown, I called Clayton from my car in the restaurant parking lot. "It's time," I said simply. The next morning, while Taylor slept in, exhausted from his evening of emotional support, I met with Clayton and his team. We spent 4 hours mapping out a strategy that would protect my interests while keeping Taylor completely unaware of what was coming. "The element of surprise is your greatest advantage," Clayton had said. "Men like your husband operate from a position of assumed control. They make plans based on the belief that their wives will remain passive and predictable." But I was done being predictable. The week after Thanksgiving crawled by like a wounded animal. Taylor moved through the house like a ghost, the unopened envelope seeming to burn through whatever pocket he'd shoved it into. I watched him check his jacket, his briefcase, his nightstand drawer, always making sure it was still there, never quite brave enough to face what was inside. I went about my normal routine with an almost zen-like calm. Morning coffee, afternoon errands, evening news. But underneath the surface I was electric with anticipation. Every time Taylor's hand moved toward that envelope, every time he started to say something then stopped himself, I felt like a pianist waiting for the perfect moment to strike the final chord. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after he'd destroyed our family Thanksgiving, I was making pancakes when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate steps that spoke of a man who'd finally worked up the courage to face his reckoning. Taylor appeared in the kitchen doorway, the cream-colored envelope clutched in his trembling hands like a weapon he was afraid would explode. His hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. He clearly hadn't slept much. "Good. Jordan," he said, his voice hoarse. "What is this?" I flipped a pancake with practiced ease, not turning around. "Open it and find out." The sound of tearing paper filled the kitchen. I could hear him unfolding the documents inside, the rustle of official paperwork that would change everything. Then came the silence, long, terrible, absolute silence that stretched between us like a chasm. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You transferred the deed." I turned around slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. His face had gone completely white, and his hands were shaking so badly the papers rattled. 3 months ago, I said conversationally as if we were discussing the weather. "Amazing how much paperwork goes unread when you're busy playing house with someone else's family. You set me up." The words came out as a hiss, full of rage and disbelief. "You planned this whole thing." I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the warmth. "I protected myself." "There's a difference." "The house," he started, then stopped, his mind clearly racing through the implications. "Holly's expecting, we've been planning. Holly's expecting a house that was never yours to give." I set down my mug with deliberate care. Funny how that works. Taylor's phone started ringing. Holly's name flashed across the screen, and I watched the color drain from his face entirely. He'd clearly promised her something he couldn't deliver, and now reality was calling. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice falsely cheerful. "Hey babe. Holly's voice was sharp enough that I could hear every word from across the kitchen. Taylor, I've been thinking about the timeline for the house sale. The kids are so excited about their new bedrooms and I want to start looking at furniture. When do you think we'll have the paperwork signed? Taylor's eyes met mine across the kitchen. I smiled sweetly and took another sip of coffee. Actually, Holly, there's been a complication. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Holly spoke again, her voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. What kind of complication? It turns out the house isn't, technically, in my name anymore. What do you mean it's not in your name? It's your house. Taylor looked at me helplessly as if I might somehow rescue him from the mess he'd created. I turned back to my pancakes, humming softly to myself. Jordan transferred the deed, he said finally. Without telling me. I found out today. The explosion that followed was spectacular. Holly's voice reached a pitch that probably shattered crystal somewhere in the neighborhood. Words like betrayed and manipulated and lying snake filled the kitchen, and I had to admit I was impressed by her vocabulary. So let me get this straight, Holly was saying when her voice finally dropped back to human range. You promised me and my children a home that you never actually owned? You made me believe we had a future when you were just another cheating husband with no real plan. Holly, please. Don't you dare Holly please me. I've wasted 8 months of my life on a man who can't even secure a roof over our heads. My children have been planning their new life and you've been lying to all of us. The line went dead. Taylor stared at his phone like it had bitten him, then slowly looked up at me. She hung up. Shocking, I said dryly. Who could have predicted that a woman looking for financial security might lose interest when the money disappears? His phone buzzed with a text message. Then another. And another. I couldn't see the screen, but Taylor's face told me everything I needed to know about Holly's final thoughts on their relationship. 23 years, he said suddenly, his voice breaking. 23 years of marriage and you destroy it all with paperwork. I turned to face him fully, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I let my anger show. I destroyed it. I destroyed our marriage. I set my spatula down with enough force to make him flinch. You stood in our dining room in front of our children and announced your plans to sell our home for your girlfriend's convenience. But somehow I'm the one who destroyed our marriage. You could have talked to me. When? The word came out sharp as broken glass. Between your late nights at work and your emergency phone calls from Holly? Between your lies about golf games and your secret credit cards? Exactly when was I supposed to have this conversation with the stranger wearing my husband's face? Taylor tried calling Hunter and Faith that afternoon. I watched him pace the living room, leaving voicemail after voicemail that went unanswered. When Hunter finally picked up on the 4th call, their conversation lasted exactly 30 seconds. We're standing with Mom, Hunter said, his voice carrying clearly through the speaker. You made your choice at Thanksgiving dinner. We've made ours. Faith's response was even shorter when Taylor reached her that evening. Don't call me again until you're ready to apologize to Mom. And I mean really apologize, not that fake corporate speak you've been using. By Saturday, I was hosting my book club brunch in the kitchen Taylor had once planned to hand over to Holly. 8 women gathered around the island where I'd laid out fresh fruit croissants and the kind of expensive coffee I'd been rationing because our finances were tight. The laughter that filled the space felt different than it had in months. Lighter. Freer. Jordan, you seem so relaxed lately, my friend Margaret commented, reaching for another strawberry. You're practically glowing. I looked around at the women who'd been my friends for years, sitting in the home I'd protected, enjoying the life I'd fought to preserve. I feel like I've finally stopped holding my breath, I said. And for the first time in months that was completely true. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday in February, delivered by a courier who looked apologetic about disturbing my morning coffee. I signed for them with steady hands, noting how Taylor had filed first, his final attempt to control a narrative that had already slipped through his fingers like water. Clayton had warned me this would happen. Men like Taylor need to feel like they're driving the process, he'd explained during one of our strategy sessions. Let him file. Let him think he's taking charge. Meanwhile, we'll be 3 steps ahead with our countersuit. I set the papers on my kitchen counter without opening them. There would be time to review Taylor's version of our marriage's dissolution later. For now, I had a life to rebuild, and surprisingly, it felt lighter with each passing day. Taylor had moved out in January, taking only his clothes and leaving behind 23 years of shared memories like they were someone else's possessions. He rented a small apartment across town, not the sprawling house he'd promised Holly, but something that would do while he regrouped. I heard through Faith that Holly had given him an ultimatum after their breakup: prove he could provide the stability she needed or lose her permanently. Apparently he'd chosen to fight for her. Spring brought an unexpected development. Faith called me on a sunny April morning, her voice bubbling with news that made my blood run cold. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," she said. "Dad's getting remarried. To Holly. In June." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. Remarried? Already? I know, right? The divorce isn't even final yet. But apparently Holly forgave him after he promised they'd start trying for a baby together. She wants to give her kids a sibling and Dad's all in. Baby. At 51, Taylor was planning to start over completely, to erase his first family and build a new one with a woman 20 years younger. The audacity was breathtaking. "Are you invited?" I asked carefully. Faith's laugh was bitter. "We both were. Hunter and I. Dad sent formal invitations like we're distant relatives instead of his children. Hunter threw his in the trash, but I'm thinking about going just to watch the spectacle." After we hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, processing this latest twist. Taylor wasn't just moving on, he was rewriting his entire identity. The man who'd complained about diaper duty when our children were babies was now promising to do it all again. But something nagged at me. Holly was 32, young enough to have more children, but why was she so focused on getting pregnant immediately? The urgency felt desperate, like she was trying to lock Taylor down with biological ties before he could change his mind again. The answer came in May, through a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I was at the grocery store when I spotted Holly in the pharmacy section, talking on her phone in hushed, angry tones. I ducked behind the vitamin display, not proud of my eavesdropping but unable to resist. "The custody agreement requires it," she was saying. "If I want to relocate the kids out of state, their father needs proof that my new husband can provide for additional children. It's some archaic clause about family planning and financial stability." My heart started racing. A fertility test. Holly needed Taylor to prove he could father children as part of her custody arrangement. But what Holly didn't know, what Taylor himself had forgotten in his midlife crisis fog, was the secret he'd buried 24 years ago. That night I made a phone call I'd been avoiding for months. "Dr. Martinez? This is Jordan Davidson. I need to ask you about something confidential regarding my husband's medical history." Dr. Martinez had been our family physician for over 2 decades. He delivered both my children, treated Taylor's high blood pressure, and knew secrets about our family that went back years. "Jordan," he said warmly, "how can I help you?" "Taylor's getting remarried. His new wife wants children. I need to know, does he remember the results of that fertility test he had after Faith was born?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought we'd been disconnected. "Jordan," Dr. Martinez said finally, "that information is confidential. I can't discuss a patient's medical history, even with a spouse." "But hypothetically," I pressed, "if someone were to request a copy of those old test results for legal purposes, would they still be on file?" Another pause. "Hypothetically, medical records are maintained for 30 years. And hypothetically, if someone with legal standing requested those records as part of a divorce proceeding." He let the sentence hang. I understood perfectly. The next morning I called Clayton with a special request. Within a week, Taylor's complete medical history was subpoenaed as part of our divorce proceedings. Buried in 24 years of routine checkups and prescription records was a single test result that Taylor had asked Dr. Martinez to keep confidential at the time. The irony was poetic. After Faith's difficult birth, Taylor had secretly gotten tested because he'd been worried about having more children. The results had shown severely compromised fertility, not impossible but unlikely without medical intervention. He'd never told me, choosing instead to let me blame myself for our inability to have more children after Faith. Now 24 years later, that same test result was about to derail his plans for domestic bliss with Holly. Clayton's team arranged for the medical records to be delivered to Taylor on his wedding day. Not out of cruelty, but because the timing worked perfectly with Holly's custody hearing, which was scheduled for the following Monday. She would need those fertility results as evidence for the court. I spent that Saturday morning in my garden, planting roses where Taylor's golf clubs used to live in the garage. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was literally blooming where he'd once taken up space. My phone rang at 4:30. Faith's number. "Mom," she said, her voice tight with suppressed laughter. "You're not going to believe what just happened. Try me. The wedding's off. Holly found out Dad can't have kids. Apparently, she opened some medical records that were delivered this morning, read them while she was getting her hair done, and by the time Dad got to the venue, she'd already left town with her children." I closed my eyes, feeling the warm sun on my face. "That's unfortunate." "Mom," Faith said suspiciously, "you wouldn't happen to know anything about those medical records, would you?" "Your father's medical history is his own business," I said truthfully. "If he chose not to share important information with his fiancée, that's between them." That evening, I sat on my front porch with Hunter and Faith, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of victory. Taylor was somewhere across town, probably sitting in an empty banquet hall, surrounded by centerpieces no one would see and a future that had evaporated like morning mist. Meanwhile, we were exactly where we belonged, in the home he'd tried to give away, building new memories on the foundation of the old ones, proving that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let someone else's choices destroy your happiness. Karma, I'd learned, doesn't always arrive when you expect it. But when it does, it has perfect timing. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn when I received the invitation in my mailbox. Cream-colored cardstock, elegant script, the kind of formal announcement that spoke of new beginnings and careful planning. Hunter's engagement party, scheduled for the first weekend in November at the country club where he'd learned to swim as a child. I ran my fingers over the embossed lettering, smiling at how life had come full circle. My son had found love with Sarah, a brilliant architect who made him laugh in ways I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. They'd been dating for 2 years, but something about this past year had solidified their relationship in a way that spoke of permanence and genuine partnership. Faith was thriving too. She'd graduated summa cum laude and landed a position at a prestigious environmental law firm in Seattle. Her voice during our weekly calls carried a confidence that hadn't been there before, as if watching me rebuild my life had given her permission to dream bigger for her own. The house had become truly mine in ways that went beyond legal documents. I'd repainted the living room in soft sage green, hung artwork I'd chosen without consulting anyone else's opinion, and converted Taylor's old office into a reading nook filled with plants and natural light. The space breathed differently now, unburdened by the weight of pretense and hidden resentments. My morning routine had evolved into something I actually looked forward to. Coffee on the back porch, 20 minutes of yoga in the sunroom, then whatever the day brought without the constant undercurrent of tension that had defined my marriage's final years. Some mornings I gardened. Others, I painted watercolors that would never hang in galleries but brought me quiet satisfaction. On Wednesdays, I volunteered at the women's shelter downtown, helping other women navigate the legal complexities of starting over. Clayton had become more than just my attorney. He'd become a friend whose wisdom extended far beyond legal strategy. Our professional relationship had ended when the divorce was finalized 6 months ago, but we still met occasionally for coffee to discuss books or local politics. He'd never remarried after his own divorce 15 years earlier, and while neither of us had broached the subject of anything beyond friendship, there was an ease between us that felt like possibility. Taylor's story had taken a different trajectory. After Holly's departure, he'd spiraled in ways that might have concerned me once upon a time. He'd lost his job 3 months after the wedding debacle, officially due to restructuring, but everyone knew his reputation for reliability had been shattered along with his personal life. His attempts to rebuild with Holly had failed spectacularly when she'd moved to Arizona with her children and a new boyfriend, leaving no forwarding address. I'd heard through Hunter that Taylor was working as a freelance consultant now, living in a studio apartment and driving a 10-year-old sedan. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms and planned other people's futures was learning what it meant to start over at 52 with nothing but his pride, and even that was damaged goods. But the most surprising development had come just last month. Taylor had called me directly for the first time since the divorce, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Jordan," he'd said, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I need to know, will you be at Hunter's engagement party?" The question had caught me off guard. Of course I will. He's my son. I want to come too, but I won't if it makes you uncomfortable. I know I've lost the right to claim space in our children's celebrations, but I'd like to try to rebuild some kind of relationship with them. If that's possible. I'd sat in my kitchen, looking out at the garden where Taylor's golf clubs used to live, considering my response. The woman I'd been a year ago might have used this opportunity to deliver one final blow, to remind him of everything he'd sacrificed for 8 months of midlife fantasy. But the woman I'd become understood that my peace didn't require his continued suffering. Taylor, I'd said finally, Hunter and Faith are adults. Their relationships with you are their choice to make. But I won't be the reason you can't try to repair what you broke with them. The engagement party arrived with perfect October weather, crisp air, brilliant blue sky, the kind of day that made everything seem possible. I chose a navy dress that made me feel confident without trying too hard, paired it with the pearl earrings my mother had given me, and drove to the country club with windows down and music playing. Hunter looked radiant in his charcoal suit, Sarah glowing beside him in a dress the color of champagne. They moved through the crowd like people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, stopping to talk with friends and family who'd gathered to celebrate their future together. Taylor arrived halfway through the cocktail hour, looking uncertain as he stood in the doorway scanning the room. He'd lost weight and his hair had more gray than I remembered, but he'd dressed carefully for the occasion. When Hunter spotted him, I watched my son's face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. What I saw surprised me. Not forgiveness exactly, but something softer than the anger that had defined their relationship for the past year. Hunter approached his father with Sarah at his side, and they talked quietly for several minutes before Hunter introduced Sarah to the man who'd missed so much of their courtship. Faith joined them a few minutes later, and I watched from across the room as my children made their own choices about redemption and second chances. They were gracious but not effusive, polite but not warm. Taylor would have to earn his way back into their lives one conversation at a time, and there were no guarantees he'd succeed. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing on the terrace overlooking the golf course where Taylor had once spent his Saturday mornings. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was claiming space in a world he'd once dominated, while he stood inside trying to rebuild bridges he'd burned for someone who'd never really known him at all. Clayton appeared beside me with 2 glasses of champagne. "How are you holding up?" I accepted the glass, considering the question seriously. "Better than fine, actually." "Good. Really, genuinely good." He smiled. "You've earned it." Looking back at the party through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Hunter and Sarah cutting their engagement cake while Faith took pictures and Taylor stood slightly apart, uncertain of his place but grateful to be included at all. This was my new life. Not perfect but honest. Not without challenges but built on a foundation of my own choosing. I'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, but reconstruction. Not tearing down the person who hurt you but building something better from the pieces they left behind. The woman who'd sat at that Thanksgiving table 11 months ago had been afraid of losing everything. The woman standing on this terrace had discovered that sometimes losing everything is just another way of saying you're finally free to choose what comes next. And what came next felt like possibility stretching out as far as the horizon, bright with promise and entirely my own. If this story of sweet revenge had you on the edge of your seat, press that like button right now. My favorite part was when Jordan calmly handed Taylor that mysterious envelope at Thanksgiving dinner, knowing exactly what bombshell was inside. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.